My name is Karol Joseph, and I was raised in a Jewish family in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. Our family was raised in the conservative Jewish tradition, so I spent my childhood going to New York, to Brooklyn, where my mother was from, for the Jewish holidays, and spending Passover there, and going to the synagogue in Massachusetts. And I was bat mitzvah at the age of 13, and I was the one child in my family. I'm one of four. I'm number 3 that really loved God. I always wanted to know God more. I wanted to follow God's law more. I would argue with my mother about being more observant because I desperately wanted to please God and to relate to God. But when I would go to the synagogue with my dad on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, he always wanted to go back to the Orthodox shul, and I would go with him. I remember being there and feeling that God was very present, but that there was something that was separating us. And I believed that God spoke to Abraham and Moses and Isaac, and not to me. And I think when I was a child, I always felt that I wasn't worthy of God's love or God's care, or of course He wouldn't speak to me. I didn't understand then what I understand today, that what was separating us was sin, which separates all of us from God. But as a child, I just wanted to know Him better. And so after my bat mitzvah, however, like many Jewish kids growing up, when I went to college and I kind of drifted away from my religious background, though I never drifted away from being Jewish. And when I would come home, I would go back to the synagogue for the holidays and practice their traditions, but explored virtually every other faith I could think of. I went to Scientology. I had a friend who was involved with Reverend Moon. I explored Jehovah's Witness, and I look back on those days and realize how grateful I am that it didn't take me long to see that those didn't jive with what the Bible said, and I knew that they weren't true. But when I went to college, I got involved in studying Buddhism and Eastern traditions, and that was in the early 70s, and that was very attractive to me, I think, because in a way you could progress yourself to some kind of a nirvana by detaching from the pain and suffering in this world. There was something that struck a chord with me. And yet none of those spiritual quests did I find what I was looking for. I had an older sister who always said that I should let go of my spiritual search and just get a good education, get a good job, make money, and then I might be happy. But I did that, and instead of finding joy and peace and happiness at the end of that road, I found a real emptiness inside of me that continued to grow and led me down a path that culminated in an eating disorder, in an addiction. And my first addiction was really work. But I was in graduate school, I was in the healthcare industry and was studying for a PhD in healthcare policy at Brandeis University, where if you were to look at me on the outside, you would have thought that I'd had it all, that I had a great job and a beautiful little condominium and drove a little red sports car and had lots of friends. But I knew on the inside that if this was it all, then I was in very big trouble, because I was miserable and anxious and depressed and fearful all the time. But my food addiction led me to a 12-step program, where the first thing I was told coming in was that I had to recognize that I was powerless over this, and that if I wanted any hope of recovery, I was going to have to admit that and turn to God or a higher power, at least to begin. And that was the first time in my 30s that I began to pray, and I was in such pain that I was willing to get on my knees and ask God for the help to make it through just one day without compulsively overeating. I was like many who struggle to saying, tomorrow I'm not going to do this, and by 10 o'clock I was doing it, and say, by tomorrow I'm going to do it this way, and by 10 o'clock I had failed to do that. Years later, reading the Bible, I heard the words of the Apostle Paul saying, that which I desire to do, I don't do, and that which I desire not to do, I find myself doing. Oh, what a wretched man I am, who can save me? And the answer was Yeshua, was Jesus. I didn't know that then. I just knew that if I turned my will and my life over to God, that one day at a time He freed me from compulsive overeating. And that was a miracle to me, like the miracle of the Red Sea parting. And so that led me to say, tomorrow I'm going to ask God for help one more day. And it worked the next day and the next day, and weeks turned into months. And pretty soon I was living in a way that was very much like what I read that God commanded us to do in the Bible. And the more I turned my life over to God's will, the more I was finding what I was lacking in my life. But I didn't come to know Jesus in that fashion. That's how the Spirit began to open me up to the truth. At the same time, while I was in graduate school, I met a Christian. The first person that ever told me he was a believer in Jesus, and he lived his life following Christ. And I watched his life, and he had the peace that the Bible calls the peace that surpasses all understanding, that I knew desperately I needed in my life. And so I was willing to talk with him, and he prayed for me, and we talked about the Bible for over 4 years before I finally came to a place of saying, God, if Jesus really is the Messiah and your Son, and you want me to know him, then you're going to need to introduce me. And I made a commitment that I was going to pray that prayer for 3 weeks. And every morning I made that commitment to God, and at the end of those 3 weeks I was having lunch with my friend Chris at school, and he said, boy, I think that you're ready to accept Jesus as your Messiah. And as soon as he said it, I thought in my own heart, I think I already have. I really knew that I knew that I knew that this was true about Jesus. It was only then that I began to read the New Testament and to find out about this Messiah that as a Jew I had never been introduced to before, except what I could catch on a Christmas movie that never really told me the truth of what the Bible said, that Jesus' death was actually as the sacrifice to pay for my sin. I had never heard that before, and I had never seen his resurrection before, that was a demonstration that his sacrifice was sufficient, and that through his sacrifice my sin could be forgiven. I didn't even know really that all that was true. I just knew that I knew God, and that I knew that it was true about Jesus, and that I knew that I had to turn my life over to him. And it was several months later that on a street corner in New York City, when I was scared to death and prayed that God would help me to just have the courage to stand where I was and to share the good news with others, that God delivered me from fear once and for all. That was 20 years ago this year. And from that time until this day, I have not experienced depression or anxiety that had plagued me every single day of my life in the years before I had come to know Jesus. And so all that I had before, I can truly say was not worth anything in comparison to what I've received after coming to accept him and know him as my own personal Savior. And I would encourage any of you that are watching this video that if you haven't done that yet, or if you struggle with an addiction, that maybe tomorrow you'll make that same commitment that I made and ask God to help you, to give you the power that you don't have for yourself, to be able to say no to the things that you need to say no to. And through that, I hope that you'll come to know what I came to know, that he really is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the only one that can give us everlasting life. Thanks for listening to me. God bless.